Joyceans, I would like to extend the warmest welcome to Professor Vincent Cheng on his long overdue trip to Taiwan. Please allow me to give you Professor Cheng's bio. Born some decades ago in Taiwan, right. Professor Cheng, whose Chinese name is Cheng Yongsheng, went on to pursue studies in English literature in the US. He received PhD from Stanford University in 1979, and his dissertation entitled Shakespeare and Joyce, A Study of Finnegan's Wake, was later published as his very first book in 1984. His next publication is the full verse translation of Corneille's Le Cid from French Alexandrine couplets into English heroic couplets in 1987. What a feat, huh? His path-breaking book, Joyce, Race, and Empire, came out in 1995. It is the first full-length study on race and colonialism in the works of Joyce, spearheading the direction of Joyce studies officially toward post-colonial studies. His next book, out in 2004, entitled Inauthentic, The Anxiety Over Culture and Identity, is the fruit of combining his pioneering study on Joyce and Irish identity politics and his own personal delving into identity politics issues such as his Asian American identity, as well as international adoption, which not only forms his own family and a family tie and lineage, but also touches on a paramount concern with the idea of heritage. His most recent book, entitled James Joyce, Nation, Memory, History, is due out later this year. As far as I can recall, Professor Cheng's last trip to Taiwan was 10 years ago. We are so glad that Professor Cheng can squeeze this break from his tight schedule to make it to Asia and Taiwan this April. Professor Cheng is now Shirley Sutton Thomas Professor of English at University of Utah. Besides teaching, for which he was granted the University of Utah's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2014, Professor Cheng has been publishing numerous articles on the subjects of James Joyce, Irish studies, post-colonial theory, Asian American studies, minority discourses, modern novel, colonial and post-colonial English literatures, etc. Besides, he has been actively engaged in academic service, such as being an advisory board member of Joyce Studies Annual and Concentric, and trustee of International James Joyce Foundation. Professor Cheng is also chairing University of Utah's English Department's Community Outreach Committee, personally engaged in reaching out to the community by giving lectures, classes, seminars, and workshops. This morning, Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures is having this great pleasure and privilege of hosting one of the two lectures Professor Cheng is delivering in Taiwan. His lecture this morning is entitled Ireland and the American South, Race, Slavery, and James Joyce. Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Cheng.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Lily, for that wonderful and generous introduction. I wanted first to thank all of you for coming here this morning, and especially I'd like to thank NTU for hosting me, and I'd especially like to thank Li and Kunyang, Professor Cheng and Professor Tran for making this visit possible, and especially Bruce for organizing everything wonderfully and efficiently, and it's a pleasure to be back in Taiwan again. Everybody has a copy of the handout. Joyce's, especially for those of you who are students, Joyce's work is difficult enough without having to guess. Since I'm going to read some passages from Finnegan's Wake, it's useful to have a handout in front of you. And yeah, that reminds me. I'm sorry, I talk fast, and after all these years of giving talks, I can't help myself. So if there's anything I say that I go over too fast, by all means, feel free to ask me to repeat it or ask a question if you don't understand. Okay. As Lily mentioned, this what I'm going to talk about today is part of the new book that's coming out, which I now sort of have a new title for the book. It's called Amnesia and the Nation, History, Forgetting, and James Joyce. And it's what I'm going to talk about today is part of the penultimate chapter. The book itself is a study of the relationships between memory, history, and the nation state, most particularly the roles of forgetting and amnesia in forming national identities and histories. Primarily, by means primarily of an interdisciplinary analysis of the works of a number of great writers, especially of Joyce, but also a number of other great writers, and drawing on the seminal thinking by theorists such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Ernest Renan, Sigmund Freud, Luria, Benedict Anderson, Yosef Yerushalmi, and others. This book explores the burden of the past, a past that one would like to forget and extinguish. The book's dual focuses are Ireland and the American South, both cultures that are burdened with what Stephen Dedalus calls the nightmare of history. From the Battle of the Boyne to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in the case of Irish history, and from the Civil War to the 2015 Mother Emanuel killing in Charleston, South Carolina, in the case of the American South. All right, you're probably asking yourself, what does James Joyce have to do anyway with or say about the American South? How much did Joyce even know about the American South? Well, I do not intend to rehearse here the influence James Joyce has had on the South, especially its writers like William Faulkner and F. Scott Fitzgerald. For example, how taken Faulkner was with Joyce's prose, stealing a bootleg copy of Ulysses to take with him on his ill-fated honeymoon, making a pilgrimage to Paris in 1925 so that he could hang around and catch glimpses of Joyce walking into restaurants, and of course modeling his Faulknerian prose on Joyce's stream of consciousness. No, what I'd like to do here instead today is to put Joyce, Ireland, and the South in conversation with each other. For the results are, as I hope you'll see, rather suggestive. I want to open with two moments, one textual, one historical, one well known to Joyceans, one not at all. First the latter, first the less known moment. It is 1877 in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the three southern cities, along with Savannah and New Orleans, that had the largest and most highly visible concentration of Irish Catholics. While many Scotch Irish had settled in the South earlier, most of the Irish who came to America in the 19th century were Catholic, many leaving Ireland as a result of the potato famine. It is St. Patrick's Day, actually the day after St. Patrick's, since St. Patrick's that year fell on a Sunday. After their traditional St. Patrick's Day parade in the morning, the Irish reassemble in the afternoon. The place is Hibernian Hall, the landmark of Irish Charleston, home of its Hibernian Society. This is the building on the screen with the Irish flags. Built in 1841 by architect Thomas U. Walter, the same architect who designed the U.S. Capitol. The building still stands today and is now a recognized national landmark. So on that day, a group of prominent Southern Irish Americans assembles there March 18th 1877, to commemorate the many young Irishmen from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia who had served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, especially Company C of the Charleston Battalion, known as the Irish Volunteers, who had fought in all the major battles around Charleston, including Secessionville, Battery Wagner, before being sent to fight in Virginia for the rest of the war. Indeed, 6 Irishmen rose to become generals in the Confederate Army. The purpose of this meeting is to raise money to build a permanent memorial to these Irish Confederates in the local Catholic cemetery. This increasingly popular practice in the South to memorialize through statues, plaques, etc., the bravery of the Confederate soldiers, increasingly portrayed as loyal and selfless martyrs to a noble but doomed cause, was a major part of that revisionist historical movement begun during Reconstruction, now popularly referred to as the Lost Cause, which has greatly shaped, for better or for worse, our popular contemporary conceptions of Southern American culture. As David Gleason writes, since the Civil War's end all over the region, white Southerners had sought to reinterpret the war effort to their own advantage. Led by organizations such as Ladies' Memorial Associations dedicated to maintaining Confederate cemeteries, they wanted to preserve the memory of the dead, but also their cause, even if it had been a lost cause. During the war, Southerners referred to their side constantly as the cause, and then afterwards as the lost cause. But this meeting in 1877 on St. Patrick's was not just a commemoration of the Confederate dead, but clearly also a public message, a public display intended to send a message to other white Southerners. We Irish are just like you. We too are loyal Southerners. We too fought in the war. We too believed in the lost cause. The organizers of this gathering wanted to make clear that their memorial would combine both Irish and Southern causes, reminding contributors of the parallel struggles for Irish and for Southern independence. By quoting from an address given earlier in 1861 at the start of the war to the newly formed Irish Volunteers as they were about to go off to the war by the Catholic Bishop of Charleston, Patrick Neeson Lynch, a native of County Monaghan in Ireland. Quote, the banner I present, Bishop Lynch began, the banner I present gives to the breeze and the light of the sun the emblems of Erin, the shamrock and the harp, with the palmetto of Carolina and the stars of our Southern Confederates. Receive this flag then, rally around it, let it teach you of God, of Erin, of Carolina. Unquote. God, Erin, and Carolina. An odd trinity, perhaps. But it was the backbone of national faith and identity for these Irish folks in the southern U.S. Indeed, a year later, the Irish of Charleston did successfully unveil the permanent monument this meeting had raised money for. A memorial plaque at the top of which stands the palmetto tree, the state symbol of South Carolina, surrounded by shamrocks, Irish volunteer muskets, and the harp of Erin hanging on the palmetto tree. This unveiling received much coverage in the local newspaper, the News and Courier, describing the Irish Volunteers as standing, quote, before the people of Carolina, the representatives of all that is great and brave and true. In other words, true Southern patriots, our own boys, no longer just foreigners and immigrants to our shores. In short, the Irish had successfully proven their Southern patriotism and were now an accepted part of Southern white culture. The more interesting question is, how had these Irish immigrants in the South, within the period of 1 or 2 generations, become so Southern and become so accepted as such by native white Southerners? Okay, this keeps going. Everybody still hear me okay? All right. Now for my textual moment, a more familiar one to Joyce's. Perhaps the most hilarious and trenchant of the parodies in the Cyclops episode of Ulysses is the extended account of Robert Emmet's hanging. I've written about this episode at length elsewhere, and I'm not going to go into the actual passage in great detail today, but I do want to discuss it briefly in terms of the dynamics of patriotic martyrdom. An episode earlier, Leopold Bloom had listened to Ben Dollard in the Ormond Bar singing The Crappie Boy, and had thought about the lines from this patriotic song about national heroes and martyrs, about the long list of martyrs sacrificed to the cause, and this is the first quotation from on your handout. All gone, all fallen. At the siege of Ross, his father, at glory all his brothers fell. To Wexford, we are the boys of Wexford he would, last of his name and race. Ireland comes now, my country above the king. When he emerges into the street, Bloom now sees, quote, Robert Emmet's last words in a shop window, and as we know, he farts while reading them. Now, in Cyclops, we get a dramatization of Emmet's final moments. The narrator in the pub tells us at this point that the men, quote, started talking about capital punishment, and of course Bloom comes out with the why and the wherefore, arguing against capital punishment. The discussion then naturally turns to hanging, and to the hanging of the Invincibles, and then to violent revolution and Emmet's hanging. In response to Bloom's attempts at reasoned argument, the citizen retorts, Sinn Féin Amen. The friends we love are by our side, and the foes we hate before us. The latter sentence is appropriately a quotation from a sentimental Thomas Moore song in the Irish Melodies, for Moore was instrumental in the sentimentalization and nostalgia of the Irish cause, what Joyce calls here the Tommy Moore touch. And now the citizen and Bloom start having an argument about the point. The brothers Shears and Wolfe Tone beyond on Arbor Hill and Robert Emmet and Die for Our Country, the Tommy Moore touch about Sarah Kern and She's Far from the Land. These specific references are instructive in terms of the nature of the myth-making of Irish nationalism. In the rebellion of 1798, the Shears brothers were both members of the United Irishmen, founded by Wolfe Tone, who were betrayed by an informant. According to the sentimentally popular version of the story, they supposedly went hand in hand to their execution, although there's no real evidence for this version. Sarah Kern was secretly engaged to Robert Emmet, who, according to a popular but equally apocryphal legend, was captured when he went to bid her goodbye before fleeing the country. A very sentimentalized version of her story was then told by Emmet's old friend and fellow student at Trinity, Thomas Moore, in his Irish Melodies, the Tommy Moore touch, in a very familiar poem in Ireland titled She is Far from the Land. Robert Emmet, hanging, and Thomas Moore will all figure prominently in this talk. Emmet, of course, was hanged and beheaded on September 20th, 1803, after a farcical and doomed attempt at capturing Dublin Castle in what was a brutally botched public execution after speaking his famous last words. When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth, then and not till then, let my epitaph be written, I have done. And as a result of this hopeless farce involving a minor historical figure, he has since been somehow incredibly raised to the highest mythological pantheon of legendary Irish heroes. Heroic iconography, holy war, and noble failure. These two are my themes today. Why this should be so about Robert Emmet is instructive in terms of revisionist nationalist myth-making, both for Irish nationalism and for Southern American nationalism. Indeed, as I will make clear, leading Irish nationalists would play a real role in Southern politics. As Robert Key asks in his magisterial 3-volume opus, The Green Flag, A History of Irish Nationalism, quote, why exactly the Emmet debacle should have become transformed into a myth of such powerful emotive force, and thus indirectly of political importance, is not immediately easy to see. His failure could hardly have been more ignominious and complete. Why was it Robert Emmet's portrait above all others that was to go up, along with a crucifix, in countless small homes in Ireland for over a century, and may even be seen there still? And indeed, if you visit Irish homes in the west of Ireland, even today, a lot of people have hanging on the wall the crucifix of Jesus on the cross, and next to it, a picture of Robert Emmet. In response, Key suggests that the proximity of the crucifix may provide a clue. The success of the Emmet myth lay in the very need to ennoble failure. For tragic failure was to become part of Ireland's national identity, something almost indistinguishable from the cause itself. Indeed, the Encyclopedia Britannica describes Emmet as, quote, Irish nationalist leader remembered as a romantic hero of Irish lost causes. Tragic failure as part of one's identity, something which, of course, was also being shaped during Reconstruction as a central part of Southern American identity. Such sentimental Irish myth-making, unfortunately, simply reinforces the stage Irish stereotypes so influentially disseminated by Matthew Arnold and others. The Irish as imaginative, creative, romantic, but politically impractical, even hopeless. Basing his ideas on the theories of Ernest Renan, who had found the quintessential Celtic mind to be dreamy and politically ineffectual, Arnold wrote, the Celtic genius has sentiment as its main basis, with love of beauty, charm, and spirituality for its excellence, ineffectualness, and self-will for its defect. A general description still believed by many, and still unfortunately offered up in many contemporary guidebooks, tourist guidebooks to Ireland. Arnold suggested that the Celt was unduly susceptible to emotion and excitement. Quote, he is truly sentimental, and with predictable logic, Arnold thus also argued that, quote, the sensibility of the Celtic nature, its nervous exaltation, has something feminine in them. And the Celt is thus particularly disposed to feel the spell of the feminine idiosyncrasy. He has an affinity to it. He is not far from its secret. This is a kind of gendered othering that has similarly been applied to both Jews and to Orientals as a way to distinguish them from the sovereign, breed masculine, imperial European subject. We find elements of such stereotyping of a sentimentalized Irish otherness reflected in, say, the ideas of William Butler Yeats, even, when he writes of, quote, men born into our Irish solitude, of their curiosity, their rich discourse, their explosive passion, their sense of mystery. Or, in the words of another Yeats, contemporary Irish stage actor and director, Ray Yeats, writing in a recent collection of essays about the famine, he writes, deep down, I think I have always known that to be Irish meant to be a lovable loser. Such widespread beliefs echo Renan's and Arnold's ideas of Irish ineffectiveness, what Arnold callously referred to as nations disinherited from political success in his study of Celtic literature, with its suggested epigraph from a person's Ossian, quote, they went forth to the war, but they always fell. A line which Yeats and others also used and borrowed. Such images only reinforced an already internalized Irish creed and imagined identity of noble failure and martyrdom of the nobility in lost causes. Everybody follow me? These are, of course, very similar to some of the stereotypes about Southerners encouraged by the South itself during its development of the lost cause identity. The Southern mindset as romantic, brave, but impractical and reckless, as opposed to a Northern mindset that was shrewd, disciplined, and practical, backed by superior Union resources and numbers. Indeed, advocates of the lost cause argued that the Confederates were not so much defeated on the battlefield as they were overwhelmed by massive Union resources and manpower. Thus, the South was destined to lose from the start, hence a lost cause. Does this sound familiar? They went forth to the war, but they always fell. But why did the Irish newcomers in the South fit in so well? There were, of course, a number of parallels that naturally made the two groups, Irish immigrants and native white Southerners, feel some shared similarities. After all, both Ireland and the South were lands with strikingly similar historical experiences of defeat, poverty, and dispossession. Both had fought unsuccessfully for local autonomy, for home rule, as it were. Both have long been thought of as the problem. England has long referred to Ireland as the Irish problem. and Americans in those days referred to the Southern Front as the romantic, wild, untamed peripheries of their respective civilized industrial centers. In comparison with their conquerors, both were seen to be backward, agricultural, semi-colonial, and supposedly romantic cultures. Both Ireland and the South had histories characterized by defeat and oppression, carrying the sort of Southern burden that C. Van Woodward, the great and late dean of Southern historians, has shown to be central to the Southern experience, or what in the Irish context Stephen Dedalus calls the nightmare of history, characterized by an incapacity to forget old times, whether down in the land of cotton, you remember the old song, old times they are not forgotten, or on the streets of Dublin. As Faulkner quipped, in the South, the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. Both have been much preoccupied with this history of defeat and with intense, sometimes bitter disputes as to the interpretation of their respective pasts. In the process, both cultures developed a nationalist myth using models, as we'll see, of religious sacrifice and martyrdom that became part of their authentic identity. The story of a freedom-loving people sacrificed to a lost cause in the face of a superior foreign power, but never giving up the holy struggle for liberation. How do we remember? How do we forget? What do we remember? What do we forget? During Reconstruction, the South developed its own form of revisionist mythology, what is popularly known as the lost cause. This is an interpretation of the Civil War developed by a number of white Southerners, many of them former Confederate generals or politicians, such as General Jubal A. Early and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, that, as historian Carolyn Janney writes, created and romanticized the Old South and the Confederate war effort, often distorting history in the process. For this reason, many historians have labeled the lost cause a myth or legend. It is certainly an important example of public memory, one in which nostalgia for the Confederate past is accompanied by a collective forgetting of the horrors of slavery. The movement portrayed the Confederacy's cause as noble and its leaders as heroic exemplars of old-fashioned chivalry, defeated by Union armies through overwhelming force and numbers. It resulted in a mania for commemoration and martyrdom that developed into a type of civil religion with its own elaborate ceremonies, parades, and memorials, icons, statues of Confederate heroes, and saints, patron saints, especially its Blessed Trinity of the generals Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson and President Jefferson Davis. Confederate cemeteries became places of pilgrimage on the various feast days of the Confederacy, which included Lee's birthday and the anniversary of Jackson's death. Whereas scholars and historians have criticized the lost cause as a comforting myth, it continues today to be an important part of how the Civil War is remembered, both in the South and in American popular culture, including novels and films. As Janney writes, the image of African Americans who had been happy under slavery but were overwhelmed by the responsibilities of freedom became widespread and could be found in the fiction of Thomas Nelson Page and Margaret Mitchell, whose novel Gone with the Wind won the Pulitzer Prize in 1937. The image also proved particularly useful to white supremacists. In the 1880s and 1890s, white Southerners, decrying Yankee aggression and black betrayal, embarked on an effort to reverse the policies of Reconstruction. Basically, and in brief, the lost cause argues 6 major tenets. One, that it was secession and the defense of states' rights, not slavery, that led to the Civil War. For secession was a justifiable response to Northern aggression against the Southern way of life. 2, that black slaves were loyal to their benevolent masters and to the Southern cause and were neither ready nor eager for the responsibilities of freedom. 3, that the war was lost in spite of the bravery of the Southern forces because of the Union's overwhelming advantages. The South was therefore destined to lose the war from the start, thus a lost cause. 4, that Confederate soldiers were gallant, heroic, and saintly. 5, that most heroic and saintly of all was Robert E. Lee, a heroic martyr to the cause. And sixth, that Southern women were loyal to the Confederate cause and were sanctified by the sacrifice of their loved ones. General Lee was portrayed in this Southern iconography as the ideal of the antebellum Southern gentleman, Christ-like in his selfless virtue and also Christ-like in his sacrifice. By focusing on military sacrifice and by depicting slavery as a benevolent institution, the Lost Cause managed to imagine the Civil War as a righteous and holy war in a doomed defense of a beloved Southern way of life, resulting in what Woodward has argued to be a uniquely Southern sense of the tragedy of history. But it is also, one should note, a very Irish one. For the repeated and remarkably seamless association of Robert E. Lee with Christ on the cross, crucified by the Yankees, is also a very Irish nationalist theme. In 1919, Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, wrote an essay on nationality in which he comments, "In the martyrology of history, among crucified nations, Ireland occupies the foremost place." Recall also the association of Robert Emmet with a crucifix. Indeed, at a Robert Emmet commemoration in 1914, Patrick Pearse, the martyr of the Easter Rebellion, Patrick Pearse called patriotism, quote, "a faith which is of the same nature as religious faith." And he referred to Emmet's hanging as, quote, "a sacrifice Christ-like in its perfection. For such a death always means a redemption," unquote. In Pearse's estimation, John Mitchell, the young Irelander hero of 1848, joins Emmet and Wolfe Tone in the pantheon of national heroes. For Mitchell's jail journal, Pearse noted, was, quote, "the last gospel of the New Testament of Irish nationalism, just as Wolfe Tone's autobiography is the first." More on Mitchell later. As Pearse wrote further, "The Irish people who wept in Gethsemane, like Christ in the garden the night before his death, the Irish people who wept in Gethsemane, who trod the sorrowful way, the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, who died naked on a cross, who went down into hell, will rise again, glorious and immortal, will sit on the right hand of God." A year now after the Easter 1916 centenary, it occurs to me to note that the poignant dramatic irony and premonition in Pearse's comment here about Christ's death and resurrection on Easter Sunday, in which, by his own logic, Pearse, who would be executed for the Easter Rising, could himself be figured as Jesus Christ. Such a direct relationship between Christ-like martyrology and a nationalist cause, while striking and audacious, would have felt totally comfortable and familiar to Southern lost causers. Indeed, novelists like Thomas Nelson Page, a leading popularizer and propagator of the lost cause, spoke of the South as, quote, "crucified, bound hand and foot, wrapped into the cerements of the grave, sealed with the seal of the federal government, dead and buried, and yet she rose again," unquote. But I want to come back now to that earlier question. Why did the Irish newcomers in the South come to fit in so well quickly? It is not, I'm afraid, a very pretty story. For the Irish in the South, both the Scotch-Irish who had settled there earlier and the Irish Catholics who emigrated in mid-century, were solidly united with native white Southerners on the key political litmus test, our peculiar institution, as the South always referred to it, of slavery, our peculiar institution. So that when war broke out, thousands of Irish young men joined the Confederate Army and filled brigades of Irish volunteers, a number of which were named after Robert Emmet, all over the South. The war gave them an opportunity to prove to their native neighbors that they belonged and were as Southern as they were, that they were fully behind the cause and the defense of our peculiar institution. This was not just a matter of proving their Southernness, however. Far from sympathizing with African slaves because they too had experienced a form of slavery back home in Ireland, Irish folk in the American South, it has to be said, fully supported slavery as an institution. Whereas most Irish immigrants were too poor to own slaves and indeed had to compete with free blacks for jobs on the bottom rung of the economic ladder, they did not oppose the institution. Those that could afford to own slaves did, including the revered Charles Carroll of the famed Catholic Carroll family in Maryland, and indeed the Irish-born Catholic Archbishop of New York, John Hughes, was himself a former overseer of slaves in Maryland. Many of the Catholic religious orders, both priests and nuns, Jesuits, Capuchins, Ursulines, held slaves. In this practice, Irish Americans in the South were forcefully and repeatedly criticized back home by the revered Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, who famously wrote to them and to the repeal associations that had been founded throughout the U.S. to support his efforts to repeal the Act of Union back home. O'Connell wrote to them, "It was not in Ireland that you learned this cruelty. Your mothers were gentle, kind, and humane. How can your souls have become stained with a darkness blacker than the Negro's skin?" Unquote. In response, many Southern repeal associations chose to either disband or distance themselves from O'Connell. The Repeal Association of Charleston dissolved itself, declaring, "As the alternative has been presented to us by Mr. O'Connell, as we must choose between Ireland and South Carolina, we say South Carolina forever." Perhaps the strongest response came from another well-known Irish nationalist, John England, O'Connell's close friend and former colleague back in Ireland. They had agitated together for Catholic emancipation, a Catholic priest who had since moved to South Carolina and in 1820 became the first Catholic bishop of Charleston. Writing now as a Carolinian from Cork, Bishop England accuses O'Connell of being ignorant in his criticisms of the South, and that, quote, "a more wanton piece of injustice has never been done to a brave and generous people." Bishop Patrick Neeson Lynch, already mentioned earlier, also an Irish-born Catholic priest and England's successor as Bishop of Charleston, was so vocal a defender of slavery that in 1864 he was named by President Jefferson Davis to be the Confederacy's ambassador to the Vatican. In spite of the fact that Pope Pius IX was strongly opposed to slavery. Lynch composed one of the last Southern pro-slavery treatises and the longest published discussion of the institution by a Confederate prelate. He himself, as a bishop, owned 95 slaves. Unfortunately, even back in Ireland, O'Connell was part of a small minority. He, along with Thomas More, stood almost alone in being bitter opponents of American slavery. Arthur Griffith, founder of Sinn Féin, was notoriously racist and pro-slavery. But while Griffith's views were extreme, they were not atypical. W.B. Yeats was proud of the fact that one of his family's ships had been designed to break the Union blockade. Charles Stewart Parnell felt a romantic sympathy with the South. So did Oscar Wilde, who, during his American speaking tour in 1882, made a pilgrimage to visit Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, at his home, and spoke warmly about Davis and Southern culture. On his way to Davis's home, the train Wilde was riding had to stop temporarily because it was blocked by a lynching taking place on the train tracks, an event which did not faze him in the slightest. John England was only one of a number of notable Irish nationalist figures who moved to the South. Several of the Young Irelander leaders of the rebellion of 1848 and numerous of their followers also ended up there after they had escaped from prisons in Ireland or Australia or Tasmania. Leading rebels William Smith O'Brien, referred to a number of times in Ulysses, and whose statue at O'Connell Bridge Bloom notices in the Hades episode, on your quotations there, I put Smith O'Brien there. Smith O'Brien, Thomas Francis Mahar, and John Mitchell all visited the South to speak and to be welcomed by Irish and Southern hospitality. O'Brien and Mitchell both supported the South in the war between the states. Mahar did not, and actually became a general in the Union Army. A number of Young Irelanders took a particular liking to the South and settled there, most prominently John Mitchell. Mitchell was, of course, the founder of the United Irishman newspaper. After the failed rebellion of 1848, he was sentenced to 14 years of penal servitude in Bermuda and then in Tasmania. While in prison, he wrote his jail journal, so admired by Patrick Pearse. Eventually, Mitchell escaped and settled in America, founding first an Irish nationalist newspaper in New York, The Citizen, then the Southern Citizen in Knoxville, Tennessee, and later the powerful Richmond Inquirer in Richmond, Virginia. Joyce mentions Mitchell twice in Ulysses. First, the jail journal is cited in Scylla and Charybdis, and then in Ithaca we are told that, quote, in 1885, Bloom had publicly expressed his adherence to the collective and national program advocated by John Mitchell and others, the agrarian policy of Michael Davitt and the constitutional agitation of Charles Stewart Parnell. Julianne Ulin has recently noted the greater presence of Mitchell's ideas in Ulysses, especially in Cyclops, and she has even suggested that he was Joyce's model for the citizen, perhaps. Mitchell, one of the major figures in the Irish nationalist pantheon, was also the most vocal in support of slavery. His views were explicitly racist. He believed, quote, that Negroes are an innately inferior people, and he wrote that, quote, we deny that it is a crime or a wrong or even a peccadillo to hold slaves, to buy slaves, to keep slaves to their work by flogging or other needful correction. We wish we had a good plantation well stocked with healthy Negroes from Alabama, unquote. Mitchell's newspapers became the voice of Irish Southerners, and in them he wrote frequently about both Southern and Irish affairs, always treating the South as, quote, the Ireland of this continent. In short, the Irish and the South were fully behind the rest of their fellow Southerners in their support of slavery. In recent years, historians and scholars of the South and scholars of race and ethnicity have tried to understand why. After all, as L.P. Curtis and others have demonstrated, the English had already long equated the Irish with simian apes and with black folks. And in Joyce, Race and Empire, I've demonstrated Joyce's awareness of these racial dynamics. Now in America, the Irish, the English had long regarded and equated the Irish with apes and with Africans. Now in America, the Irish were regarded as an in-between race, frequently referred to as, quote, niggers turned inside out. Blacks, for their part, were sometimes called smoked Irish. Thomas Nast's famous cartoon in Harper's Weekly, titled Black Slaves and White Apes, equates as equal in political weight but brutish Irish-American voters with ape-like features and freed black slaves. As a result, the Irish immigrant competing with freed slaves for the most menial jobs was not automatically considered a white American. The labor competition frequently resulted in bloody riots and violent disputes between Irish immigrants and black workers, both considered not white, both in the North and in the South. In the South, Karen Quinlan suggests, Irish Catholics were anxious to be identified with Southern culture. David Gleason suggests that Irish immigrants supported slavery because it made them members of the ruling race. Their white skin and their acceptance of slavery automatically elevated them from the bottom of Southern society, and through their support for slavery, the Irish gained native respect. In his provocative, controversial, but ultimately, I find, convincing book of How the Irish Became White, Noel Ignatieff goes further, arguing through a detailed study of American labor history and the resulting violence between the Irish and African Americans, that the Irish in America managed to achieve whiteness on the backs of African Americans, basically by distinguishing themselves from the blacks that were being racially lumped together. And they did so by proving to white America that they hated black people more than anyone else, that they could engage in racist violence more than any other immigrant group, and that they should no longer be simply thought of as one of the darker races. In the South, this meant that through their support of the institution of slavery, through their participation in fighting in the war on the Southern side, and through their part in lost cause commemorations of their Civil War dead, Irish Southerners had gained admission and unquestioned acceptance as Southern white folks, as part of the white republic, with all the attendant privileges of that designation. The Lost Cause movement was reflected in many cultural productions, including a number of prominent novels and films that have greatly influenced popular conceptions of the South, such as the novels of Thomas Nelson Page and of Thomas F. Dixon Jr. The latter's controversial 1905 novel, The Klansman, was then adopted by the sort of classic early film director D.W. Griffith into his highly successful and landmark silent film, The Birth of a Nation, and that's the theatrical release poster for the movie when it came out. A film that inspired the virulent growth and spread of the Ku Klux Klan. In portraying the emancipated slave as a threat to both democracy and to white womanhood, Birth of a Nation defended white supremacy in an era when lynching was taking place commonly and unapologetically. In both the book and the movie, the Ku Klux Klan is portrayed sympathetically as upholding the noble traditions of the South and of the Confederate soldier by defending Southern culture and Southern womanhood against assaults by both freed slaves and northern carpetbaggers during Reconstruction. But perhaps the most influential product of lost cause thinking were the most influential cultural products of lost cause thinking were the spectacularly successful 1936 novel by Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind, the best-selling novel still of the 20th century, and the equally popular 1939 film version of her novel. And, you know, the plane ride from the States to was so long, and nowadays on the plane, you know, you get a choice of 400 movies to watch. I just thought, okay, I hadn't seen it for years, so I watched Gone with the Wind again, all 3.5 hours of it. And it really is, in some ways, a wonderful film, but just so dangerous in its depiction of the way the white families love their darkies, and the darkies love them back, and how mean the Northerners were, and all of that, and how heroic Ashley Wilkes and the Southern soldiers. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this film, but it still influences our ideas of what Southern antebellum culture was like. As Carolyn Janney notes, until the middle of the 20th century and even longer in Virginia, it's until now, there's still a controversy in Virginia about textbooks, depictions of the Civil War. Textbooks presented a picture of the Civil War and race relations that owed much to Gone with the Wind. Plantation slaves are sentimentally portrayed as happy members of the family, with affection and loyalty between white masters and black slaves. White Southerners are portrayed as noble, heroic members of a romantic culture, tragically destroyed by an unstoppable and destructive force. Notably, though, the story has as its very center an Irish Catholic family in Georgia, the O'Haras, who own a plantation in Georgia named after the ancient seat of the High Kings of Ireland, Tara, the famous plantation of Tara. There have been lately a number of fascinating scholarly studies on Irishness in Gone with the Wind, which I don't have time to go into at length here. In the novel, parallels to Irish history are frequently cited. For example, Sherman's burning of Atlanta is compared to Cromwell's massacre at Drogheda, and so forth, along with frequent references to Robert Emmet, Thomas More, and so on. Kieran Quinlan argues, indeed, that Gone with the Wind is far more Irish and far more Catholic in its references also than has generally been acknowledged. Margaret Mitchell, herself the daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants, wrote to one of her fans about, quote, the part we Irish played in the building up of our Southern section and in the Civil War, in which, quote, our Southern Irish became more Southern than the Southerners. When the trouble in the 60s began, that is the war, they went out with the Confederate troops and did great things for their new land, unquote. But what is finally most noteworthy is the simple fact that in the novel and the film's depiction of Southern identity, an Irish Catholic immigrant, Gerald O'Hara from County Wicklow, Ireland, could be accepted as a perfectly natural, unquestioned part of the plantation landscape, as the model patriarch planter. It was now perfectly acceptable to equate Irishness with Southerners. As Gleason notes, thus the archetypal Southern belle in the popular mind, Scarlett O'Hara, was the daughter of an Irish Catholic. The ease with which the public accepted the Irish immigrant and his fictional family as true Southerners emphasizes just how well the Irish had blended into the native population. And in the film, there are even scenes of the O'Haras praying together in chapel and saying that Catholic after tradition, something now that would seem really weird as in fundamentalist Protestant Southern culture. There's much more I could say about Joyce, race, whiteness, and blackness. But for the rest of my time now, I want to focus for a few minutes on the presence of the South. So everybody's still, you're patient, everybody's still with me. I want to focus on the presence of the South for the rest of my talk in Joyce's works, for he was certainly not unaware of the South, especially as a land being increasingly settled by Irish immigrants. Recall that in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, young Stephen Dedalus remembers that quote, and here I'm going back to the quotations on your handouts, that He had heard his father say that Dante was a spoiled nun and that she had come out of a convent in the Alleghenies when her brother had got the money from the savages for the trinkets and the chains. The real-life Dante Conway in the Joyce household, Elman tells us, never actually made it to America, for she had, quote, been on the verge of becoming a nun in America when her brother, who had made a fortune out of trading with African natives, the savages, trading for the chains and trinkets, died and left her 30,000 pounds. The fictional Dante's experience at a convent in the South, though, was not unusual. After the South's defeat in the war, the few Irish emigres still going to the South were mostly missionary priests and nuns. Quinlan notes that the recent discoveries of the diaries of 2 Irish Dominican nuns from comfortable families, but who had probably been sent to America because they didn't have the dowries necessary to support them in their convents at home, we might add, nor wealthy brothers, cast a revealing light on contemporary racist Irish attitudes. Joyce certainly couldn't have read Gone with the Wind, which came out in 1936, before he wrote Ulysses, which came out in 1922. But it is very tempting to imagine anachronistically that he had. For in one of the most striking coincidences in Joyce's texts, we find in the Aeolus chapter a reference to Daniel O'Connell's monster meetings at Mullaghmast and at the Hill of Tara, where hundreds of thousands gathered to hear him speak and urge repeal of the Union. Here we find within the same line as a reference to Tara the phrase, and this is on your handout, Gone with the Wind, hosts and Mullaghmast and Tara. But even without reading Gone with the Wind, Joyce clearly associated the South, and especially African slavery, with Georgia, both in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. In the Cyclops episode, soon after the discussion of Emmett's hanging, the men in the pub turned their attention to a newspaper story that features a picture titled Black Beast Burned in Omaha, Georgia, a description of a Southern lynching. A lot of Deadwood dicks in slouch hats and they firing at a sambo strung up in a tree with his tongue out and a bonfire under. Lynching, a term associated in Ireland with the Galway lynches, and there's some argument that etymologically our term lynching or hanging comes from the Galway lynch tribe, was itself invoked just a few lines earlier. Joyce was citing an actual lynching incident reported in the London Times, a story which itself was anachronistic since the source incident took place on September 28, 1919, and thus could not have been in the Dublin papers in 1904. In the reported incident, the black victim had been accused of raping a young white woman. The white lynch mob hanged him, then riddled his body with bullets and burned it. The mob then tried to lynch the mayor for trying to stop the rampage against blacks which ensued. It was the London Times that mistakenly reported Omaha as being in Georgia rather than in Nebraska. Joyce thus naturally assumed that this racist atrocity took place in Georgia, in the heart of the Deep South. Indeed, such a lynching incident in the Deep South could well have come out of the film Birth of a Nation, and Joyce certainly knew about both the Griffith film and about the Ku Klux Klan, for there are numerous references in Finnegan's Wake to both Birth of a Nation and to the KKK. For example, at the very beginning of Book 2, Chapter 3, in Finnegan's Wake, we find a passage clearly having to do with competing ethnic, racial, and national identities. It is Hiberio-Miletians and Anglo-Norman donated him Birth of a Notion that was breeder to sweat of slaves, with references to Hibernians, Milesians, Norsemen, and Anglo-Norsemen, all part of the birth of an Irish nation. Interestingly, Birth of a Notion is described here as a breeder of the sweat of slaves, which was certainly true of the American Birth of a Nation. There are a number of passages in Finnegan's Wake referring to either the KKK, like Curse's corduroy caricature, or to Birth of a Nation. But I'd like to conclude today with a brief, close reading for a few minutes of the opening page of Finnegan's Wake in terms of the American South and of its black-white dynamics and slavery problem. By the way, another odd coincidence is that in 1914, a year before Birth of a Nation came out as a film, Griffith released a movie called The Escape, which the great Lillian Gish, the actress who was the star of Birth of a Nation, recalled as one of the finest films Griffith ever made. Unfortunately, there are no surviving copies of this silent film, and it is now considered a lost film. But what's interesting to me is that the lead character in that film's story is called, of all things, Jim Joyce. Finnegan's Wake begins, of course, with the famous first line describing the topography of Dublin. River run past Stephen Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by commodious beacons of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. I've quoted the passage that follows in your handout, and we'll discuss it line by line, focusing only on those allusions relevant to my topic of Joyce and the American South. Sir Tristram, violet d'amour, frower the short sea, had passing port re-arrived from North America on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to wield or fight his peninsula war. Joyce had written Harriet Shaw Weaver that Sir Emery Tristram, first Earl of Howth, changed his name to St. Lawrence, born in Brittany, that is North America, Tristan and Isolde, etc. Unquote. The name St. Lawrence further evokes St. Lawrence O'Toole, the first Irish-born Bishop of Dublin and the patron saint of Dublin. But the name Tristram also conjures up some name doubles, especially, as Joyce pointed out, the young lover Tristan, who falls in love with the beautiful Isolde or Isolde. In the Arthurian legend and in the Wagner opera, you recall Tristan, one of the knights of the Round Table, was the nephew and heir of King Mark of Cornwall, and was sent to fetch Isolde back from Ireland to wed the king, only to fall in love with her himself. So Tristan would cross Frover, like the wild rover in the traditional Irish drinking song, would cross Frover, the shore of the Irish Sea, from Brittany as a passenger from North Armorica, that is Brittany, to get Isolde from Ireland, Europe Minor. But this had not yet happened. Passencourt, or pas encore in French, not yet. And so we get two different time frames here, doubled. Indeed, the entire passage is about doubling, both geographically and temporally. Not yet is the repeated refrain of the passage. Tristram and Tristan. Armorica suggests America. For the Irish people would in time be doubled and split up, since in the 19th century thousands and thousands would leave the Emerald Isle, especially for North America, thus passengers re-arriving in North America, the two lands with the most Irish people in the world. The geographical and temporal doubling is between the Old World and the New World, where millions of Irish folks would be doubling the Irish population. That is to say, settling in places like Dublin, Georgia, a town on the Oconee River in Lawrence County, Georgia, first settled by Irish immigrants. Okay, and so this opening page takes part of it takes place in a town in Georgia called Dublin, Georgia, on the same in Lawrence County. The opening page of Finnegan's Wake indeed anticipates how in the American South the Irish would double themselves as white American Southerners. But not yet. Pas encore, for this had not yet happened. Nor had Top Sawyer's rocks by the stream of Coney exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County gorgeous while they went doubling their mumper all the time. Not yet had someone's rocks exaggerated themselves, which is to say one's rocks, one's balls, one's penis, one's genitals, had not yet exaggerated themselves and grown into an erection. Erection leads to sex, which leads to procreation, which leads to the doubling of your population, thus doubling your number all the time with the help of mum. Top Sawyer's Rock is, believe it or not, an actual rock formation on the Oconee River in Lawrence County, Georgia. Or here, Lawrence County, Gorgios. How Joyce knew all this is beyond me. Top Sawyer's Rocks is a formation next to the town of Dublin, Georgia, founded by a Dubliner named Peter Sawyer, the Top Sawyer, a town whose motto is, quote, doubling all the time. Indeed, the Irish are doubling all the time, procreating many children who then move away from Dublin to the American South and start new cities also named Dublin, thus doubling their number all the time. From North America, Brittany, to Ireland, from Ireland to North America, the Irish are indeed doubling all their time, creating new Dublins. Likewise, Sir Tristram and St. Lawrence, patron saint of Dublin, get doubled here in Lawrence County, just as James Joyce himself exaggerated his own rocks and doubled himself in his son Giorgio, here as Gorgios. This is pretty amazing stuff. Weird, but amazing. Let me add that Top Sawyer here also echoes, of course, Tom Sawyer. In a book about Irish Finns doubling themselves into Finnegans, Tom Sawyer and his rival Finns are American versions of the warring twins, Shem and Sean, always fighting like Tristan for the love of Isolde or Issy, and fighting to replace their old father figure, King Mark, here Mark Twain, fighting, in other words, to be the top Sawyer. By the way, this leads me to ask an intriguing question. As those of you who are Americanists may know, in recent years, American studies scholars have speculated on the issue of, is Huck Finn black? I would like to ask, along with Noel Ignatieff, could Huck also be Irish? After all, Finn is as Irish a name as you can get, and Huck is a sort of Finn again. As Mark Twain himself wrote about the character Huck in a letter, the boy's mouth is a trifle more Irishy than necessary. As Ignatieff notes, even if Huck's Irishness is a pure fancy, it suggests a profound truth about America, that the national character embodied in the country's most beloved literary figure is part Irish as well as part Negro. Unquote. I'm now going to skip a couple of sentences and get to the next paragraph. The fall of a once Wall Street old par is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. The story of mankind is, in a sense, a story of double. The rise through one's rocks and erections and fall of generations. There are a number of versions of the fall suggested here, including Eden, Babel, and the Thunder Words. Tim Finnegan on the magazine Wall, and in North America, the Great Fall of Wall Street in 1929, the fall of a once Wall Street. This is a story retold early in bed and later on life in the Old World down through all Christian history. In the New World, it is retold through Christian minstrelsy. The Christie Minstrels were, of course, an American blackface minstrel group led by Edwin Pierce Christie, who famously performed Southern slave culture. In other words, they're white folks painted black, pretending to be Negro slaves, dancing and singing and doing, and it was a very popular music hall sort of performances in both America, and the Christie Minstrels traveled all over England and Ireland also. There's been a lot of fascinating scholarship in recent decades on blackface and on black minstrel shows, including most recently surprising arguments by musicologists that in spite of the inherent racism of blackface, these minstrel shows were popular because they in fact quite accurately portrayed black slave music and dance. And also work on the fascinating fact that most of these blackface performers were Irish. I could talk more about that another time. But what I do want to point out is that Joyce was obviously familiar with this American musical genre. This is clear in Ulysses when in Circe, Bloom describes a minstrel show. Eugene Stratton, even the Bones and Cornermen at the Livermore Christie's. Bohee Brothers, Sweet for that matter. Eugene Stratton was a well-known American blackface impersonator playing in Dublin that very night, June 16, 1904. The Livermore Brothers, world-renowned court minstrels, were also American Christie minstrels in blackface who had played in Dublin in 1894, and whose show included blackface cornermen armed with bones, as the instruments were called. The Bohee Brothers were another pair of blackface Christies who had played Dublin. Bloom's Circean fantasy now conjures up a typical scene from one of these minstrel shows. Tom and Sambohee, colored coons in white duck suits, scarlet socks, upstarched sambo chokers, and large scarlet asters in their buttonholes, flashing white Kaffir eyes with smack-fat clacking nigger lips, playing their banjos and singing, "There's someone in the house with Dinah." Although this is one of Bloom's fantasies, it is also a quite accurate description of what minstrel shows like the Livermore Brothers or the Bohee Brothers were actually like, with their exaggerated and stylized representations of Negro stereotypes. White Kaffir Eyes refers to G.H. Churgwin, another music hall entertainer who performed in blackface with large white diamonds painted around his eyes, billing himself as the White-Eyed Kaffir. Now back to the first page of the Wake, and to my conclusion. The next sentence describes the fall, the chute, in French, chute, describes the fall of Finnegan and Finn McCool in Phoenix Park by the Castle knockout in the park, where oranges have been laid out to rust upon the green since Devlin's first love, Liddy. Ever since Dubliners have first loved the River Liffey, there have been ethnic, racial, and religious rivalries, enmities, hatreds, and war. For the hatred between the orange and green has resulted in many bodies being laid out to rest in the green cemeteries of Ireland. What now follows is a paragraph about bitter wars and hatreds between rival groups competing for dominance. What clashes here of wills and wants? Oyster gods gagging fishy gods. Quacks, quacks, quacks. Wallu, wallu, wallu. Quah. There are many clashes and battles in this paragraph. Wills against won'ts, oyster gods against fishy gods, ostrogoths against Visigoths in the Battle of Catalonian Fields, followed by what I take to be, via Aristophanes, the frogs, the sounds of battle, or battle cries. But notice that these battle cries, kek, quacks, 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 repeatedly suggest KKK. For the central racial rivalry and ethnic violence in the Irish New World, in the world of Dublin, Georgia, is that between black and white, between black slaves and the white boys of the KKK. Indeed, in the very next sentence, we get a number of versions of these competing twins, like Tom and Huck, fighting to replace old King Mark Twain. Where the Battle Aries partisans are out to Master Malachus McGrains and the Verdons catapulting the camo ballistics out of the white boys of Hootie Head, siege gates, and boomerang strums. There are many weapons being used here in the midst of a battle between partisans. A battle Arie is a type of sword, Ares is the god of war, a partisan is a type of lance, a Malchus is another type of sword, a Verdun is another type of lance, as well as the World War I Battle of Verdun. Catapults and ballistics are also here. And the partisans themselves are the competing Shem and Sean in the form of Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan, for we have one partisan from Baudelaire's Paris, Battle Aries partisans, trying to master the other, Malachi Mulligan. Cannibalistics and boomerang strums also suggest black cannibals, and we have racial issues between blacks and whites again. Not only in colonial Africa, assegais are African spears, but also in Australia, between white settlers and Aborigines. Boomerangs are used as weapons by Aborigines down under, and most notably also in the land of the KKK and Dublin, Georgia. White boys of Hootie Head recalls not only the white boys, 18th century Irish insurrectionists dressed in white shirts, but of course the white boys with hooded heads of the Ku Klux Klan. Orange versus green, Protestant versus Catholic, European versus African, Aussie versus Aborigine, Klansman versus black slave. Joyce is lamenting all these forms of internecine violence and hatred. All of this senseless hatred and killing of one's own countrymen and brothers must have appalled the pacifist Joyce. Or so I read the next sentence, which is the last one I'll analyze today. Sod's brew they may fare, sang glory and save, arms appeal with alarms appalling, killy, 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 a toll, a toll. All this killing is enough to make one want to swear God's blood by my faith, but also the blood shed by Irishmen, the sod's brood, the brood of Ireland, the old sod, as well as the old sow who eats her brood. Say glory and save us. Say glory and save. For there is no real glory in all this killing, sans glory. Only blood, song in French, and tears, some glow in French. All this war and killing and hatred, killy, 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 KKK again, involves guns, arms, and a lot of noise, Laird in German, full of the peal of bells, knelling the toll of death, a toll, and for whom the bell tolls. Australia is here again, perhaps an atoll, perhaps referring to the atolls of New Ireland in New Guinea. It is indeed appalling, for we should raise our arms in a tearful appeal for peace. Arms appeal with larms appalling. Larmes, of course, is French for tears, as you appeal in tears of arms appeal as we contemplate the toll of death and for whom the bell tolls. This pacifist appeal about the human cost of war and violence, that is, death and blood without glory, is to my mind one of the most moving passages in Finnegan's Wake. And Joyce's two prime examples of this cost are the violence of orange versus green and of black versus white, the killing between Irishmen of orange and green persuasions, and the killing of blacks so long equated racially with the Irish by the white boys in hooded heads of the Ku Klux Klan. In that new Ireland of the New World, in the new Irish Dublins in places like Lawrence County, Georgia. A toll indeed. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Cheng, for sharing with us this chapter of your forthcoming book, which makes us really start to look forward to its publication. And the content of your talk is so dense. I'm sure it's rather baffling to especially the main audience here today, who are our undergraduate class in American literature. They're taking their course in one of the required courses in American Lit. So now, so there's so much nightmare that you help to unfold before us. Probably it's a little heavy-handed. So now the floor is open, and I'm sure if you have questions of whatever kind, I'm sure Professor Cheng will be very...
I'd be happy to answer questions. I just looked at my watch and I thought, oh my God, you guys are so patient and tolerant. I thought this talk was going to take 50 or 55 minutes. It took a lot longer than I expected, so thank you for your patience, and I'd be happy to... First of all, feel free to ask questions about anything that was not clear. As well as anything else you would like to ask. I'm trying to decide if I should encourage you, especially the students, to watch Gone with the Wind or not. Because it's in some ways a wonderful and powerful movie, and it is so dangerous in its rewriting of history. And the real question my book tries to tackle is, since we can't remember it, since memory is always incorrect, how do we remember, and what should we remember, and should we try, and are there things that we need to forget?
Well, just something I thought of when, in the beginning of your talk. You mentioned that noble failure seems to be one of the genes in the Irish blood, and I just happened to thought about a Beckett quote about the failure part: ever tried, ever failed, no matter try again, fail better. So maybe in that way we can see the Irishness in Beckett. Yeah, that's just one observation. And the other is that, well, we've heard a lot from you about Irish in the South. And how about Irish in the North? And how do they look at their, say, compatriots in the South and really turning from a more liberal stance, I guess? But in another way, maybe Irish in the South is a bit luckier than those in the North because they get this a bit, maybe, well, it's just a means for them to get into the community. And that's a chance that's not available to those in the North.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The Irish in the South, as you gather from my talk, were they wanted to prove that they belonged. Okay, the Irish in the North also wanted to prove that they belonged, but they had a different challenge. They were competing not with black slaves, or in the South, in places like New Orleans, the Irish had to compete with freed blacks for the few bad jobs that they were available at the bottom of the economic rungs. But in the North, the Irish had to compete with all sorts of immigrant groups in the cities for survival. You know, Italians, Romanians, Jews, and so forth. And but in fact, it's not a much prettier story. They tried to. There are all these, and Ignatius' book is very good in chronicling all these labor riots between Irishmen and Italians, and sort of gang warfare in trying to establish like who gets domination in Philadelphia over jobs in the fire department or jobs in the police department. The stereotypes of Irish cops in New York and Philadelphia comes from the fact that they basically set up gangs to keep certain professions Irish, and not let the Italians or the Jews become part of it, and so forth. And so there was a different kind of internecine labor warfare going on, and there are terrible. There were terrible in the 19th and early 20th century labor riots in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, in which the Irish burned whole immigrant neighborhoods of competing groups, in order to kind of get their foothold in. So it was a different kind of not pretty story. It didn't involve slavery, of course, but it really involved a lot of also violence to establish their place in American culture. And as long as I'm talking about movies, if you've seen movies like The Gangs of New York that depict that history.
Professor Cheng, thank you for coming to my class, actually.
This is your class. Yes. Thank you for bringing your class. And I apologize to you and to your class if I talk too fast and not everything is easy to understand.
It's very enlightening. I'm asking this question in behalf of my class, and of course myself too. We have been reading Faulkner this semester, and we were just reading Flannery O'Connor, who I believe is also Irish.
Yes.
So, could you enlighten us more about the connections between these two authors and Joyce, if you see any?
Well, the connections between Faulkner and Joyce are easy to talk about because there is a direct line of influence, of course. I love Faulkner and I teach Faulkner, but it's hard to imagine novels like Sound and Fury and Absalom, or even As I Lay Dying, existing without Faulkner having read Ulysses. Though I would say that Faulkner's love for stream of consciousness, this is not something necessarily that is of use to your class, but it just occurred to me that Faulkner's use of stream of consciousness means that what we call Faulknerian prose, that almost every character in Faulkner's later works speaks the same way. The stream of consciousness feels Faulknerian, which is, I think, that's probably not fair. I mean, Shreve and Quentin and Sutton do speak different, do think differently. But in Joyce's stream of consciousness, I think we can immediately detect what voice is Stephen, what voice is Molly, what voice is Bloom, and so forth. Flannery O'Connor, I don't know, I mean, I don't know that I can think of any direct Joycean relationship, but certainly she is one of a whole sort of host of Southern Irish writers who were very conscious of their Irishness. I studied as an undergraduate with the great poet and translator of Homer, Robert Fitzgerald, who was himself Irish and Irish Catholic, and he and his wife were the executors of the Flannery O'Connor estate. And we have all of these Southern Irish writers who, in a lot of ways, and artists, look back to their Irish roots, their Catholic as inspiration, and that includes movie makers like John Huston, who's still, until his death, kept a boyhood home in the west of Ireland, and who made the film version of The Dead and so forth. But I don't know any direct, references, or maybe somebody else does, between Flannery O'Connor's work and Joyce's. And for those of you who teach Irish studies or other courses, I apologize for saying nasty things about Oscar Wilde or Yeats, and certainly for Parnell.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk, and I enjoy it very much. And I also learned a lot from the talk. I would like to ask one very trite question about Finnegan's Wake. It's mainly about Giordano Bruno's idea of the coincidence of contraries. I totally agree with you that the first few pages is about the war in the heaven and also the battles on the earth, and the last passage that you quoted is really very, very moving. But somehow there are also some very funny elements in it that has been incorporated into the entire passage, the first few passages, and also the entire book, as a matter of fact. So, for example, the Christian ministry, basically that is a kind of slapstick kind of play. It's kind of burlesque. And also...
you mean the black-faced minstrels?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, right. And also the pursuit is a very funny word. There are lots of layers of meanings, and
and
lots
you
of them are
remember
quite funny.
the spelling there of the shoot. The French word starts with CH, of course, but the spelling there, some of you may remember, was the sound in Circe, the spelling of when Stephen hits the lamp and the light goes out, he goes, spelled exactly that way. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. And also, the last passage that you quoted, it seems it's a kind of a children's rhythm, like, for example, killy, killy, killy. So, that, getting back to my question about the reading of Finnegan's Wake and how we interpret it, and of course that this is quite moving when we talk about the atrocities and also the brutalities of the wars. But also, how do we deal with all those very funny elements? Because that was simply watering down, that sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's a good question, and it's a question in a lot of ways. You also hinted at this when you started that. Really, it's a question you have to ask about all of Finnegan's Wake, because this is a book that is at the same time hilarious. I mean, when I have undergraduate students who take class with me and they read Dublin or Portrait or even Ulysses, and then they ask, should I go on and read Finnegan's Wake? My answer is, okay, how crazy are you? I have certain tests. If you're crazy enough, you qualify, because it is both hard and crazy and difficult, but incredibly funny and incredibly obscene, and incredibly serious. And all of these things are there in every passage together. And you have to have a mind that is able to, I didn't want, those of you who know the Wake, I didn't want to have to deal in that first passage. Notice I skipped over the thunder word, ba 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 ba, etc. Because I just didn't want to have to explain that the fall was the Tower of Babel in different languages, but that Joyce also thought of the sound of the fall, which is actually, after all, tragic. The fall of civilizations, the fall of human beings, the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, was also, Joyce imagined it to be the sound of thunder and lightning, so he gives us words for thunder in 30 different languages. But he also thought of as it was God taking a crap at the same. So how do we take these things simultaneously as hilarious, as serious? A lot of it is obscene. Exaggerating the rocks. When I have students read that passage and I say, "What do you think it means?" and there are all these giggles, like, "Okay, it couldn't really mean that." Yes, he does really mean that. I guess I don't know how to answer that, except that this is the problem you point out is endemic to the whole book, and not just to this passage. And I'm just focusing, for my purposes, on what I see as the pacifist reading there, and the complaints about the way Protestants and Catholics kill each other, and the way whites and blacks in America kill each other, in spite of the fact that all of this serious stuff occurs simultaneously with obscenity and with humor. Does that make any sense? I don't know how else to answer that question, except that that's one of the things I think we have to accept about Finnegan's Wake, is that everything is, as the word in Ulysses is Jocko serious at the same time, both funny and serious. So I don't know if that satisfies. I'm not, for the students in the class, I'm not sure if I'm doing a very good job of making you want to read Joyce. Except, let me say, I can say from my own experience that when I was a high school student, well, this is a different world with the internet, but when I was 16 years old, somebody told me that Ulysses was a dirty book. So, of course, I had to read it. So I went to the library and took it out and started reading it from page 1 on. Somebody should have told me to start from the back. But I got about 2 chapters in, and I thought, this is too hard work and nothing dirty about it. So I returned it to the library, and I took out D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's. And then the movie version came out, and when I was 17, and it was X-rated, so you have to be 18. I tried to get into the cinema, and they kicked me out. In a lot of ways, Joyce's later books, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, are wonderful in part because they both offer a kind of graphic. In the world of the internet, you can get graphic anytime you want, but they offer almost shockingly frank depictions of reality, as well as great serious thinking and prose writing. So, I'm not sure about terrifying you from ever reading Ulysses.
Professor Cheng, thanks for your wonderful speech. I'm a PhD student, and your speech really inspired me, because I'm really thinking about writing a dissertation about cultural commodification in Joyce. Cultural commodification in Joyce, because I noticed some, in W's literature, he dreams to write some sentimental Irish poetry and becomes a famous poet, and also a little cloud, or a mother, Mrs. Kearney, she wants to profit from this movement of Irish Renaissance. And you mentioned that you draw a parallel between these sentimental character in Ireland and also this similar sentimental character in American South. And you also use the example of Gone with the Wind or The Birth of a Nation, and I found they both were huge box office success at that time. So I would like to ask, what you think about these? They use this kind of reconstruction of memory as kind of for commercial value to appeal to the market. And what do you think of this kind of phenomena? It uses nostalgia or to idealize the past, for this commercial purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, if I could give a full answer to your question, we'd be here for another hour. It's a great question because one of the things I struggled with in writing this book was whether remembering is even a good thing. Because there's no way to remember without coloring it with distorted imagination. Any form of memory or writing history is really creative writing. Because and there are ways in which, when you talk about pop culture and commodification, and I mean, look, I'm talking the Thomas More melodies. They are basically the center. His poems are a lot of them were put to famous songs that every Irish person knows. She is Far from the Land is a song that most Irish kids learn. There are movies and plays made of this totally fabricated, sentimental story about how Robert Emmet was captured and executed because he wouldn't get on the boat because he wanted to see his fiancée one more time and stuff like that. And they serve their purpose, certainly. But they also really distort. Every commodified memory serves a purpose. Just as Gone with the Wind is a powerful fiction because it allows not only the South, but also I grew up in other countries studying American history and reading novels and watching movies like Gone in the Wind, and I believe that this was what the South was like. Ashley Wilkes as the saintly, high-minded soldier defending his culture, and so forth. And it allows, on the one hand, the first and obvious answer is that it allows for a kind of whitewashing of history that conveniently forgets that slavery was awful. And we have, and we do that all the time now. In the States, there was last year this popular children's book that came out that caused a big uproar because it was the story of George Washington and his slaves. And they depicted George Washington's slaves as being very happy and not wanting to leave, and so forth. And the reality is George Washington did have a slave and the slave who had a daughter, and they ran away. They wanted to get away. But it's much more convenient. But as I say, it serves a purpose because it's some ways much more convenient for everybody to believe the nostalgic, sentimentalized version. And it's not always true that that's a bad thing. I mean, Gone with the Wind and this example, or even the hit musical Hamilton, distorts the fact that, you know, made Alexander Hamilton look like this high-minded, free-thinking Hamilton owned slaves. You know, but when I say that, they're also, it's sometimes good for a culture to forget, or to, only because you can't always be fighting the same battles over and over. Does that make any sense? Now, these are both examples that I think are very dangerous versions of them. But then there are, you know, speaking of, to answer your question of sort of the commodification of, say, music about the Troubles or Irishness. Joyce's evocation, for example, of really sentimental songs like The Lass of Aughrim in The Dead is, on the other hand, a wonderful attempt to use a modified cultural product to combat the other forms of remembering present in the story, such as the statue of King Billy on College Green, defeating the Catholics at the Battle of the Void, or the Wellington Memorial that Gabriel is always thinking about. And those are forms of state-sanctioned national memory that glorify the imperial past. What is available to the Catholic Gaelic underclass? They cannot have castles and statues and memories that they to remember their past. What they have is songs and folk tales and ballads. I don't know that that's a long-winded answer to a complicated question. Does that deal at all with something you were asking?
Yes.
It sounds like you're on an interesting project.
Professor Cheng, thank you for your very inspiring speech. Well, I'm a master's degree student here. Forgive me if my questions seem too basic. Yeah, I was just thinking about, you mentioned the lost cause. And I was just wondering whether in the era or in the time of perhaps 1915, the time when The Birth of a Nation the movie was made, in that era, whether this lost cause, how much proportion of the Southern Americans believe in the lost cause, and how much percentage or proportion of these people to believe in them can we call this a collective identity formation?
Yeah, that is the South is a complicated place. In 1915, when Birth of a Nation came out, I mean, you know, the lost cause ideals, the idea of the lost cause was formed in the second half of the 19th century, after the humiliation, the poverty, the exploitation of the South during Reconstruction. It became a way of nostalgically imagining the beauty of what we had, and blaming somebody else for its loss. And it was already very powerfully ingrained in, I think, white Southerners trying to understand what happened. But when things, its influence came up in the early 20th century when in cultural production, in films like Birth of a Nation, or novels like The Klansman, or a little later, Gone with the Wind, because what happened when The Klansman and Birth of a Nation came out, Birth of a Nation was one of the most important films in film history. Those of you who are cinema buffs know all about it. It was popular all over the world. But it also, within a decade after Birth of a Nation came out, membership in the Ku Klux Klan skyrocketed. It allowed for the lost cause movement, which I think white Southerners already really believed, that this was what happened. It allowed for that it allowed for them to also accept racial violence and lynching and the Klan as part of it. And I didn't go. The Ku Klux Klan, their dress, their customs are all based on old Irish and Scottish rituals. And so, in some ways, I think the effect of popular culture taking on images of the lost cause really led, I would say, not just the South to see that as an inherent part of Irish identity, but really the whole country. Much of the world and the American nation now believes that this is what antebellum Southern culture was like and what Southerners are like. Of course, the contemporary South is very different, but there are a lot of white Southerners who still cling to the tenets, and it's really weird studying and reading about it. There's a wonderful book I recommend anybody called Confederates in the Attic, written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who studied all the groups who try to reproduce the Confederacy and try to simulate old Civil War battles and stuff. And you realize that, as one of them said, the South didn't lose the war. It's just halftime. That a lot of Southerners still aren't able to accept what happened.
So, we just finished on the thought. Yes, so let us give Professor Cheng a round of big applause for his wonderful talk.